What's up, beautiful people? In today's episode of History Through Political Cartoons, we are taking a look at the history of the Cold War, at least the early period. So let's get it going. And so, one of the big challenges facing the Allies is how they were going to reconstruct the post-war world. And although this cartoon is hopeful that the Allies would be able to repair the damage caused by Hitler and the rise of various totalitarian regimes, in the cartoon you see the big three kind of portrayed as helpful doctors nursing the world back to health. The reality is a whole different story. And one of the big conflicts was over the fate of Eastern Europe. And even before the end of the war, the differences began to emerge. And this cartoon shows the big three trying to put the world back together, and the pieces won't fit, largely because the U.S. and the Soviets have dramatically different goals for this post-war world. In this cartoon, which is critical of the Yalta Conference, which happens in February of 1945, you see Stalin is seen as taking advantage of Churchill and FDR. You can see Stalin has already taken over Eastern Europe and now is reaching for more land. And remember, at Yalta, FDR and Churchill had gotten Stalin to agree to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, but that commitment is going to be abandoned by Stalin at the end of the war. And Yalta is really one of those pivotal moments. At Yalta, the U.S. was eager to get the Soviet Union to pledge to join the war in the Pacific against Japan. Stalin does agree to do so 3 months after the war in Europe is done. But you all know how the story turns out. By July of 1945, the relationship was rapidly falling apart as these different visions began to emerge. And this cartoon kind of alludes to the magnitude of what was coming at Japan by this point in the war. Not only do we see the atomic bomb, courtesy of the Manhattan Project, but by July and August of 1945, it is now 3 months since the war in Europe has ended and the Soviet Union is about to enter the war against Japan. And some argued Truman was compelled to drop the atomic bomb to not only end the war quicker, therefore saving American lives, but also to prevent the Red Army from taking over parts of Asia and establishing more spheres of influence beyond just Eastern Europe. Now, this cartoon takes the perspective that the atomic bomb increased tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, and the cartoon is really addressing the controversy when in late 1945, Truman talked about not seeking territorial acquisition while also affirming their reluctance to share atomic secrets with the Soviet Union. Now, once World War II ended, it seemed likely that the US and the Soviets were headed towards a different kind of conflict. And while this cartoon is seeking to find some common ground between the two sides, in many ways, the different post-war goals made many feel like the gap between the two sides had become too big to bridge. And remember, you can trace the differences for the post-war world even before the big three formed and even before we got into World War II. You know, the Atlantic Charter was the general principles for a sound peace that was agreed upon by FDR and Churchill in August of 1941. And in this agreement, they talked about trying to create a world based upon self-determination for all people, no territorial expansion, and of course, free trade. Now, this British cartoon was published after the homie Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, and it shows Churchill getting a peek under the Iron Curtain. And it does glorify the progress made in the Soviet bloc. You know, you got industry thriving and looming over the rest of the world. And Churchill's speech was meant to inspire action by the United States and England to try to stop or address this Soviet threat. Now, the reality was, by 1946, the Soviet Union had created a sphere of influence in much of Eastern Europe, which the Iron Curtain speech was alluding to. And the conquest of Eastern Europe was relatively easy. Remember, the Red Army after the Battle of Stalingrad had begun to, quote, liberate Eastern Europe, and the Red Army occupied much of Eastern Europe after the war. And what you see in places like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, there were some elections held, but the results were oftentimes rigged to ensure pro-Soviet communist victories. And so the Yalta Agreement was very quickly violated. Now, Stalin saw the establishment of pro-Soviet governments in Eastern Europe as not only a way to advance communism, but also as a way for the Soviet Union to protect itself from future attacks. And what is meant by this is these pro-Soviet governments, these satellite governments, would serve as a buffer from another invasion from the West. And to accomplish these security goals, Stalin arrested or executed non-communist leaders from places such as Poland. And while Stalin justified it on the grounds of security, the West saw Stalin's moves in Eastern Europe as nothing more than empire building. Now, this cartoon reflects the growing concern over the fate of Greece and Turkey by President Truman. You see the communist figure kind of peering down at these two countries, the greasy turkey. And in both countries, the threat of communist takeover was real. In Greece, there was a communist uprising against the government, and in Turkey, the Soviets wanted influence in the Mediterranean Sea. And so there was active efforts underway to try to turn those two countries communist. And it is in Greece and Turkey you see the first implementation of the containment policy. Under the Truman Doctrine in 1947, the U.S. pledged $400 million in military and economic aid to assist, quote, free people against totalitarian regimes. And you could see the US dollar going to defend the Mediterranean in this cartoon right there. Now, this was a radical departure from previous US foreign policy. As you can see, Uncle Sam is on a new path that is ripe with dangers. And the reality in Greece and Turkey was not as simple as Truman portrayed it. You know, it's not as simple as the supporting of free people against the big bad Soviets, although they were playing a role. As with most things in history, things were complicated, but we were firmly committed to containment by 1947. And in 1947, in June, this cartoon reflects a growing feeling that Stalin would seek to expand to the rest of Europe, beyond the Iron Curtain. Especially of concern is Western European nations like France. You could see the question mark on France, and places like France and Italy were badly destroyed by World War II, and there was a growing concern about growing communist movements in these countries. What if countries such as France joined the Soviet bloc, or what if they voted for communist in the next election? And it's important to note, many European countries had experienced years of depression, and then they got into World War II, and America was largely avoiding European affairs during this period in the 1930s. And so this is a big moment. Do we help Europe? Or others question, can we afford not to help Europe? And this is another important moment of the Cold War when we decide to help Europe. The Marshall Plan was announced in early 1947, and basically what it would do, it would provide over $17 billion of aid to Europe. And the idea was we would help Europe recover, and that would keep them from turning to the Communist Party in the upcoming elections. And this fear of Soviet takeover is very much represented in this cartoon, where you have the big Russian bear shadowing Western Europe. And the idea of the European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan, would be help rebuild the continent so that communist influence would not grow. And this cartoon reflects the view that communism would be brought in from abroad, when in reality, in some cases, largely in France and Italy, the communist movements were homegrown communist parties, although often with Soviet support. So it gets really messy during this early period, and you can see clearly the view that it was up to the Marshall Plan passed by Congress to help this growing threat and to help the countries of Western Europe rebuild. Now, the Soviet Union was opposed. Stalin was opposed to the Marshall Plan for a variety of reasons. He was concerned that money would go towards rebuilding Germany, which had recently invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviets lost a lot of people during World War II. And they also did not like that the money would provide for the U.S. to have influence over Eastern European countries which they saw as important for their security, as well as imposing communist rule. Aid was rejected by the Soviet Union because in the Soviets' mind, they viewed the Marshall Plan as nothing than another example of U.S. economic imperialism. Now, the impact of the Marshall Plan was quite dramatic, as this cartoon reflects. The U.S. supported Europe with this aid. You could see them kind of helping ride the bike, kind of like training wheels. And eventually, by the 1950s, Europe had largely recovered, preventing any communist political gains and also ensuring a market for U.S. exports. So, part of this is not only containing communism, but also creating a free market global economy. And the Marshall Plan is a huge success. Now, the biggest crisis of the early Cold War will occur in Germany, which was divided after World War II between France, England, the US, and the Soviet Union. And in June of 1948, Stalin cut off access by land to Berlin, which was also shared by those four countries. Now, this was a bold move, as the US, British, and French sections of the city had over 2 million people living in it, and these people were now cut off from the world. Now, the reason why Stalin does this is he's seeking to prevent the formation of a unified anti-communist West German nation, and he felt the blockade would force the West to back down. Now, this move is risky because this could very quickly escalate into another world war, but neither Truman or Stalin were eager to fight another war But Truman also did not want to back down in the face of Soviet aggression. Remember the lessons of appeasement that the Munich Conference represents. And this cartoon shows Stalin's blockade had failed as Truman orders an airlift that will last for 11 months. In that time, 2.3 million tons of supplies will be transported into West Berlin on more than 270,000 flights. And while Stalin definitely could have shot down these planes, that would have further escalated the situation, which neither side wanted. And this cartoon from a West German newspaper points out the importance of the Berlin airlift to many people. This word right here in German means save, and so this was not just about Berlin, but the Berlin airlift is also symbolically about protecting Europe against the Soviet threat. And by May of 1949, Stalin ends the blockade, but this event, the Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade, intensified the division between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Shortly following this event, fear of Soviet expansion and aggression led to the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, and NATO would pledge the U.S. to protecting Europe from an attack. And this formally ends any kind of commitment to old Jorge Washington's advice about avoiding permanent alliances with European nations, because under NATO, an attack against one member was considered an attack against all. And these events were just the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviets will create their own military alliance with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, and in 1949, many Americans will be shocked when the Soviets test their first atomic weapon, thereby ending the U.S. monopoly on atomic weapons earlier than many analysts had expected. And this atomic bomb test will accelerate an arms race between the two superpowers, and new showdowns will occur around the world, which we will cover in our next video. Thank you for watching. If it helped you out, click like, tell a friend, and subscribe. Check out apushexplained.com for more resources. Have a beautiful day. Peace.